Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered the operational space of the federal committee, believing the absolute worst phases of Washington's institutional combat had already been endured. She possessed verified historical data to support this internal assessment. The representative had previously navigated the hostile architecture of Senator J.D. Vance, an environment dominated by static, unyielding paper receipts that fundamentally refuse to vanish while a politician attempts to verbally manipulate the narrative. She had also survived Senator John Kennedy, who utilized the acoustic weapon of a slow, deliberate drawl to systematically read her own statements back into the permanent record. The methodology was functionally equivalent to watching an individual pour gasoline onto an open flame one precise teaspoon at a time. Following these high-impact encounters, the subject executed a massive mechanical rebuild of her physical and political presentation. She actively repaired the defensive armor, calibrated her sitting posture, disciplined the microscopic movements of her hands, mapped the exact coordinates of the broadcast lenses, and returned to the witness table, operating under the functional assumption that public humiliation was merely an abrasive form of technical rehearsal. The specific theater designated for this engagement was Hearing Room H 313, located deep within the United States Capitol complex. The physical dimensions of this space are fundamentally different from the cavernous, forgiving Senate chambers utilized during her previous audits. Room H 313 is mathematically tighter, acoustically closer, and structurally engineered to capture the microscopic biological betrayals that a larger room easily absorbs. Network producers had officially designated this event as the third hearing, with the unblinking feed transmitting live via C-SPAN. The broadcast cameras were positioned at a proximity that effectively eliminated the safety buffer between the witness and the national grid, waiting patiently for the next viable wound to materialize. Within this highly restricted perimeter, the representative assumed the posture of an organism intimately familiar with the physics of public damage. Her physical stillness was not a naturally occurring biological state. It was a heavily engineered containment protocol. The jawline was locked into a preset, rigid geometry because the Kennedy exchange had demonstrated the exact liability of an unguarded pause. The hands were meticulously controlled, resting in a deliberate formation because the Vance exchange had successfully demonstrated how easily paper evidence can dismantle expressive physical gestures. The designated water glass positioned on the mahogany table remained entirely untouched. In the forensic environment of a federal hearing, sudden hydration registers as a symptom of acute internal stress, and any unchecked biological twitch carries the immediate risk of being algorithmically converted into tomorrow's viral thumbnail. She exhibited the grim, unyielding discipline of an entity that had been systemically dismantled on national television on 2 separate occasions and had subsequently reconstructed herself using high-level consultants, posture adjustments, and absolute message discipline. She fundamentally understood that the stage was simultaneously functioning as a trap. Operating under the explicit directives of her communications apparatus, she initiated the sequence not by establishing a defensive posture, but by executing a preemptive rhetorical strike. She attempted to fundamentally invert the mechanical structure of the room, effectively putting the institution itself on trial and transforming the oversight table into a campaign platform. Approximately 8 minutes into the opening statement, she bypassed standard procedural language and directed a highly personalized assault at Speaker Mike Johnson. She adopted the vocal cadence of a celebrity prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. She systematically mocked his personal beliefs, derided his political ascension to the speakership, and publicly questioned his basic jurisdictional authority to evaluate her performance. She concluded the sequence by deploying a highly engineered attack line optimized for immediate social media distribution. She verbally challenged his legislative productivity, explicitly stating that he was entirely incapable of passing a budget, reforming immigration, or unifying his own caucus for a single news cycle. The terminal strike of her statement asserted that the only item Johnson had consistently passed was the collection plate. The physical gallery immediately generated the sharp, collective acoustic sound that the Capitol frequently utilizes to signal a successful hit. It was a practiced, synchronized gasp laugh produced by a room full of political operatives who habitually mistake performative cleverness for verified institutional victory. However, the fundamental physics of a verbal insult require the target to actively absorb the energy and respond in an identical elevated frequency. Speaker Johnson entirely refused to engage the mechanism. He did not deploy standard defense protocols. He did not interrupt her vocal output, he did not execute a dismissive eye roll, and he did not attempt to forcefully reclaim the acoustic space of the room. He sat perfectly still, enveloped in the strict uniform of a dark suit and a red tie, projecting the unyielding patience of an individual conditioned by years spent in courtrooms and classrooms. He understood the mathematical certainty that these specific environments eventually penalize any actor who confuses theatrical performance with actual documented preparation. While the representative was actively delivering the exact phrasing designed to trigger his public humiliation, the high-definition lenses captured Johnson engaged in a secondary, silent activity. He was utilizing a pen to write in extremely small, precise, and neat handwriting. The physical formation of the letters did not resemble the hurried, chaotic scribbling of a politician reacting to incoming fire. It possessed the deliberate, methodical geometry of a final verdict being carefully drafted to ensure it would successfully survive an appellate review. When he finally elevated his visual focus from the paper to the witness, his facial architecture registered zero thermal heat. The complete absence of anger functioned as the primary warning signal within the room. Anger generates predictability. Absolute calm generates extreme danger. Representative, I appreciate that, Johnson stated. The vocal delivery was completely flat, devoid of sarcasm, and entirely polite. This specific deployment of professional courtesy was structurally cruel, as it effectively provided the representative with absolutely zero kinetic energy to push against. He then executed the singular physical movement that permanently altered the operational dynamics of the hearing. He reached forward and opened a binder. This object was not a thin, superficial folder. It was not a lightweight stack of talking points printed explicitly to simulate the appearance of serious oversight on camera. It was a massive, physically imposing structure. It was heavily tabbed, meticulously organized, and systematically color-coded. It was the exact physical artifact that belongs to an individual who once evaluated student exams and never fundamentally deactivated that specific cognitive machinery, even after transitioning to the highest levels of the federal government. With the deliberate opening of the rings, the physical properties of room H313 instantly shifted. The environment ceased to function as a theatrical stage designed for partisan exchange and immediately locked into the rigid parameters of a formal assessment. Johnson explicitly stated for the federal record that he possessed zero intention of arguing with the witness. That single calculated declaration instantly vacuumed the oxygen out of the representative's entire survival strategy. Argument is the specific habitat where her brand thrives. Argument generates the elevated heart rates, the sharp physical gestures, and the viral media clips that allow political supporters to categorize any factual inquiry as a hostile attack. But a performance review operates on a significantly colder frequency. A performance review fundamentally does not care if the subject feels offended by the process. It ignores the volume of the room, bypasses the carefully constructed armor, and requires the subject to confront a single, unforgiving reality, whether the verified work was actually completed. The forensic audit initiated its primary diagnostic sequence by examining the subject's operational capacity within the international sphere. Speaker Johnson physically turned to the first tab within the binder, recalibrating the chronological and geographical coordinates of the room back to the 13th of February 2026. The specific location was the Munich Security Conference in Germany. To properly contextualize the failure, the auditor must first establish the physical parameters of the Munich environment. This is not a domestic campaign rally, nor is it an insulated television studio engineered for viral sound bites. It is mathematically the most important annual gathering of foreign policy leaders on the planet. The physical space is occupied exclusively by active heads of state, global defense ministers, and top-tier national security officials. Furthermore, the underlying structural subtext of the representative's attendance was publicly verified. She was actively being positioned and evaluated as a potential presidential candidate for the 2028 election cycle. Within the strict mechanics of global diplomacy, a presidential speculation is not treated as a media accessory. It operates as a live, high-stakes audition. Johnson directed the committee's focus to a single critical variable from that audition, the Taiwan question. He read the exact phrasing of the prompt into the congressional record. Would and should the United States actually commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China were to move? In the architecture of modern American foreign policy, this is not a trick question, nor is it an obscure hypothetical. It is the defining, inescapable binary question of the geopolitical era. Johnson did not summarize her response. Summaries can be categorized as partisan interpretations. Instead, he deployed the most lethal forensic tool available in a legislative hearing, the unedited transcript. He read the representative's answer in its entirety, mechanically reproducing every single vocal hesitation, and the extensive verbal padding she utilized to build a long rhetorical runway that ultimately never achieved a cognitive takeoff. This specific methodology was structurally devastating. A hostile paraphrase can be easily dismissed by a communications team as a bad faith distortion. A clipped video can be attacked as an out-of-context manipulation. But an unedited verbatim transcript possesses the brutal, undeniable advantage of being mathematically accurate. Johnson's vocal delivery, maintaining the unyielding patience of an instructor correcting a term paper in front of a live classroom, established the central failure. The representative had not articulated an incorrect policy position. She had articulated absolutely zero position. He systematically outlined the available structural options. A competent entity auditioning for executive power could have deployed the framework of strategic ambiguity while bolstering Taiwan's defense grid. She could have leaned on the established legal parameters of the Taiwan Relations Act. She could have explicitly advocated for avoiding military commitments in the Pacific to pursue absolute diplomacy. Any of those specific coordinates would have actively demonstrated to the global assembly that the candidate had physically opened the briefing book, comprehended the geopolitical architecture, and selected a definitive lane of operation. Instead, the transcript proved that the representative provided 20 seconds of unstructured vocal filler, generating the distinct acoustic signature of a student desperately waiting for the professor to change the subject. Johnson then turned the page within the binder, advancing the timeline exactly 3 days forward to a subsequent engagement at the Technical University in Berlin. The subject had shifted from the Pacific to South America. The representative had been directly questioned regarding the United States' policies toward Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Johnson read her exact documented response into the microphone. The representative had publicly declared that the United States could not unilaterally kidnap a foreign head of state and engage in acts of war just because the nation is below the equator. Following the recitation of this quote, Johnson executed a deliberate pause. In the physical mechanics of a federal audit, a properly timed pause inflicts significantly more structural damage than any volume of elevated shouting. Venezuela is above the equator, Johnson stated. With that singular flat correction, the entire parameters of the hearing fundamentally shifted. The evaluation was no longer engaging with complex ideological theories or grand philosophical divides. The room had abruptly transitioned into a basic assessment of primary school geography. The physical reality of the planet Earth is not subject to political spin. Venezuela structurally sits within the Northern Hemisphere, positioned precisely between roughly 1 degree and 12 degrees north latitude. This is not an obscured metric hidden deep within a classified intelligence annex. It is a permanent cartographic fact. And geography as a discipline remains entirely unimpressed by an individual's social media follower count, their capacity to generate fundraising capital, or their ability to project moral outrage through a camera lens. The correction landed on the witness table with the small, clean, undeniable violence of a red pen striking across an examination paper. Johnson maintained his absolute restraint. He explicitly acknowledged the statistical reality that all human subjects occasionally misstate facts. However, the core of the audit was not the isolated verbal stumble. It was the massive underlying void the stumble revealed. He introduced the physical existence of the State Department briefing material. Every member of the United States Congress authorized to attend an international security conference receives a densely compiled intelligence book. The specific briefing binder for Munich 2026 contained comprehensive data on Venezuela. The global map was prominently featured. The Equator was explicitly marked. The homework was not intentionally concealed from her. It had been physically handed to her prior to the aircraft's departure. Therefore, when the representative stood on European soil, actively participating in a forum designed to test executive readiness and physically relocated a sovereign nation to the Southern Hemisphere, it ceased to be a mere miscalculation. It functioned as a high-resolution X-ray. And the resulting image did not display a simple, broken sentence. It displayed a terrifying, empty cognitive space where basic foundational preparation was mandated to exist. Johnson did not utilize any terminology questioning her baseline intelligence, which structurally made the indictment far more lethal. By maintaining the premise that she was highly capable, he eliminated her ability to claim the status of a victim. He framed the failure as a deliberate operational choice. The representative had apparently processed the internal calculation that achieving extreme fame within the domestic political entertainment complex was a functional substitute for actual, rigorous preparation on the international stage. It was the specific, catastrophic error made by a brand that has completely internalized its own marketing algorithms. Johnson closed the first tab of the performance review. He looked up from the binder and delivered the terminal evaluation for the first category, foreign policy. Not passing. The words descended into the acoustic space of the room not as a partisan insult, but as a finalized, unalterable academic grade. The structural audit executed by Speaker Johnson now required a deliberate transition in altitude. The binder's next color-coded tab redirected the room's focus from the macro environment of international security conferences to the highly localized micro-environment of domestic representation. The physical parameters of the evaluation shifted directly to New York's 14th congressional district. This specific geographic coordinate encompasses defined portions of the Bronx and Queens, containing a verifiable population metric of roughly 718,000 residents. Within the structural mechanics of the United States government, a congressional district is not a theoretical concept or a digital backdrop. It is an active zone of continuous administrative emergency. The 718,000 constituents represent real biological subjects experiencing real daily friction against broken federal systems. The daily operational ledger of a district office is dominated by raw data, poverty indicators, unemployment metrics, delayed Social Security disbursements, frozen immigration files, and stalled veterans' benefits. This constitutes the quiet, unglamorous, mechanical center of a federal representative's actual employment. Within the severe parameters of a performance review, constituent service functions as the ultimate diagnostic test because it is entirely immune to the physics of national celebrity. An administrative backlog does not care about viral speeches. A missing federal check is completely unaffected by an ideology. Furthermore, as Speaker Johnson articulated into the permanent record, a physical constituent possesses a fundamental operational difference from a digital audience. Constituents cannot unsubscribe. 13 million followers on a social media grid will never require the representative's office to physically answer a telephone to prevent a family from facing financial ruin. Johnson did not deploy theatrical outrage to highlight the discrepancy between the representative's national profile and her local execution. He simply read the verified operational hours of her district infrastructure. He stated that her primary Bronx district office was open to physical constituent walk-ins, exactly one weekday per week. He allowed the number one to drop onto the mahogany table like a heavy, undecorated brick. He then entered the secondary data point. The Queen's office facility was systematically locked and closed to the public every Friday. He logged the communication metrics, noting that incoming calls to the office grid frequently registered as unanswered. When constituents actively sought assistance with critical federal services, the automated systems instructed them that the office operated strictly by appointment only. Johnson allowed the absolute absurdity of this administrative protocol to hang suspended in the acoustic space of Room H 313. The requirement of an appointment implies that human desperation and bureaucratic collapse will politely wait for calendar availability. The fact pattern assembled by the Speaker was fundamentally devoid of glamour, but it was mathematically lethal. It did not allege a grand partisan conspiracy. It simply documented the slow, agonizing humiliation of ordinary citizens attempting to get their elected representative to pick up a telephone. To ensure the data could not be dismissed as a Republican fabrication, Johnson introduced a localized human receipt. He extracted a verified quote from Laura Vasquez, a registered constituent residing in Woodside, Queens. The quote stated, without any ideological ornamentation, that the Congresswoman had done nothing for the community she was once again elected to serve. The origin of this specific sentence was critical. It did not originate from a conservative pundit, a rival political campaign, or a television studio engineered to simulate analytical outrage. It originated directly from the ground floor of the district, where the utility of national media tours and high-fashion gala appearances mathematically drops to zero. The forensic Zoom then isolated a specific chronological event, the district town hall. Johnson mapped the timeline, noting that the local event had been postponed because the representative had fallen ill while returning from a heavily promoted national fighting oligarchy tour. When the town hall eventually materialized on the physical schedule, the operational parameters were severely restricted. The event was held for a total duration of less than 1 hour. Inside the packed auditorium, the representative processed exactly 6 constituent questions. Upon the completion of the 6th question, she immediately executed a physical extraction through a side exit, entering an idling SUV waiting to transport her away from her own district. 1 hour, 6 questions, 1 idling SUV. Under the cold illumination of these specific metrics, the phrase fighting oligarchy ceased to function as a revolutionary movement and instantly registered as a severe scheduling conflict with the actual constituents. The genius of Johnson's structural dissection was its absolute plainness. He did not verbally accuse the representative of harboring negative emotions toward her voters. Such an accusation is easily deflected. Instead, he placed her national itinerary directly beside her local availability, allowing the chronological ledger to execute the accusation automatically. A calendar is the ultimate forensic document because a calendar is where priorities permanently stop pretending. The ledger displayed 14 different cities across 7 states for the national tour, a keynote address in San Francisco, multiple appearances on national media broadcasts, and international transit to the Munich Security Conference. In that exact same chronological window, one shortened 60-minute town hall for the 718,000 individuals who legally hold her employment contract. Johnson utilized this contrast to define the baseline floor of congressional duty. He established that answering phones, hiring caseworkers, and keeping physical doors unlocked is the minimum operational standard required before an official begins auditioning for the presidency. He concluded the evaluation of this tab by applying a single, unspinnable classification to the 14th district, underserved. Once the mathematical facts had opened the door, there was no ideological shield thick enough to block that specific word. The forensic audit conducted within the perimeter of Room H 313 had systematically dismantled the subject's international architecture and her localized district interface. Speaker Johnson then manually advanced the binder to the next color-coded tab, shifting the diagnostic focus to the absolute structural core of the congressional profession. He transitioned the assessment to legislative output. Within the operational physics of the United States Capitol, legislative output represents the singular metric that cannot be simulated, artificially generated, or algorithmically enhanced by online popularity. A physical law exists, or it mathematically does not exist. Johnson looked directly across the mahogany table and delivered the primary calculation without any trace of theatrical pleasure. Representative in 8 years in the United States Congress, you have sponsored 0 bills that were signed into law, he stated. The forensic zoom must isolate and expand upon the massive structural disparity contained within that single sentence. The room was evaluating a political entity possessing a national profile large enough to actively bend domestic news cycles and a fundraising apparatus capable of generating massive capital. She maintained a media footprint large enough to position her as one of the most universally recognized members of the federal legislature. Yet, at the terminal end of the performance review, the verified legislative score extracted from the congressional database was an absolute unyielding 0. The restraint in Johnson's vocal delivery made the absence of enacted legislation feel significantly colder. He preemptively neutralized the standard defensive protocols by deconstructing the representative's primary branding assets. He addressed the Green New Deal, noting that while it was formally introduced into the congressional record in 2019, it was structurally classified as a non-binding resolution. In the rigid mechanics of federal governance, a non-binding resolution is fundamentally not a law. It is not an enacted statutory program. It possesses 0 operational authority to alter the material, economic, or regulatory reality of the republic it claims to be transforming. Johnson then moved the analytical laser to the Inflation Reduction Act. He noted that the representative had publicly claimed credit for specific provisions integrated within the massive legislative package. However, the audit revealed that the final IRA text did not actually contain a provision extracted from the Green New Deal. Furthermore, Johnson established the mechanical distinction between claiming rhetorical ownership over capital that navigated through alternative channels and the actual physical process of passing proprietary legislation. This distinction isolated the exact difference between institutional governance and public branding. It exposed the structural gap between achieving a verified legislative victory and deploying highly polished press release terminology engineered to merely simulate achievement for an audience scrolling too quickly to verify data. To finalize the legislative assessment, Johnson cited a documented index demonstrating that her bipartisan ranking was situated near the absolute bottom among all House Democrats. While bipartisanship does not automatically guarantee moral superiority, it serves as an empirical diagnostic tool. It reveals whether a legislator possesses the internal mechanical capacity to build the working coalitions required to convert theoretical proposals into binding federal law. After 8 consecutive years of employment, the empirical evidence of that specific capability was not merely thin, it was entirely absent. The evaluation then immediately transitioned from the public void of legislation to the internal machinery of office management and financial compliance. As the binder opened to the financial tab, the hearing room was stripped of whatever residual comfort remained. Financial compliance does not represent the glamorous sector of political operations. It does not generate synchronized applause from supporters, nor does it produce viral clips engineered to trigger algorithm engagement. It consists entirely of dry, repetitive administrative machinery, expense categories, standardized filings, certified treasurers, documented disbursements, and rigid compliance protocols. Serious organizational entities meticulously maintain this machinery for a singular purpose: to prevent the operation from wandering into federal investigations where they are subsequently forced to claim they are the victims of partisan persecution. Johnson explicitly stated that he was not attempting to litigate the ultimate legal outcomes of her open files. He correctly noted that the House Ethics Committee and the Federal Election Commission operate their own independent investigative processes, possess their own evidentiary standards, and maintain their own jurisdictional authority. However, as a strict metric of executive management, as a baseline test of whether a congressional operation is sufficiently careful, disciplined, and adult enough to manage federal power, the financial record mirrored the exact same failures identified in the previous tabs. The financial apparatus was structurally sloppy in sectors that demanded absolute discipline. It was loud and reactive in zones that required quiet precision. Johnson extracted a highly specific anomaly from the FEC filings. He read an entry documenting an $18,725 payment directed to a medical psychiatrist. This specific disbursement had been officially categorized on federal disclosure forms as leadership training and consulting. This line item immediately became the exact type of granular detail that destroys administrative credibility when exposed to the fluorescent lighting of an oversight hearing. Johnson did not attempt to process the data into a theatrical joke, nor did he stretch the evidence beyond its physical boundary applied. He simply applied the logic of an auditor. A functionally competent campaign apparatus possesses internal tripwires to catch an anomaly of that magnitude before the ink touches a federal filing. Serious organizations employ professional treasurers and execute multi-layered review processes because they understand that assigning a bizarre administrative category to an unusual payment instantly triggers an alert the moment the ledger becomes public. Logging a massive payment to a psychiatrist who specializes in ketamine therapy under the administrative umbrella of leadership training is not an entry that seamlessly glides through a rigorous professional compliance system. It operates as a verified receipt, proving that no adult within the organizational structure was checking the homework before it was submitted to the federal government. The audit escalated to a larger structural irregularity. Johnson introduced documentation tracking a sum of $885,000 that had been physically routed through an entity known as Brand New Congress, LLC. The compliance failure embedded within this transfer was geographical. The representative's own chief of staff simultaneously controlled both the LLC receiving the capital and her proprietary campaign apparatus generating the transfer. Johnson deployed the phrase potentially very big trouble to describe the architecture of this specific maneuver. The terminology was not selected for its dramatic resonance. It was deployed because it accurately mimics the exact vocabulary utilized by former federal regulators and forensic auditors. The Federal Election Commission does not care how righteous a political brand sounds on television. It strictly analyzes the mechanical flow of capital. The ultimate point landing on the mahogany table was highly concentrated. Competent individuals managing serious power do not invite this volume of federal scrutiny. They do not survive audits because they possess unassailable moral purity. They survive audits because they are meticulously careful. They hire experienced adults, they construct rigid review systems, and they actively catch bad categorization before it breaches the perimeter. They fundamentally understand that a movement entirely constructed upon the premise of moral superiority cannot financially operate with bookkeeping that looks like an intern hurriedly mislabeled expenses, while hoping federal regulators would only read the headline. This concluded the assessment of the fourth operational tab, the fourth consecutive failing grade, The forensic audit executed by Speaker Johnson had successfully dismantled the subject's operational records across 4 distinct categories. However, the most devastating evidence entered into the permanent record of Room H 313 was not contained within the paper ledger. It was broadcasting live through the biological reactions of the subject sitting at the witness table in the highly pressurized, enclosed environment of a federal hearing when a politician's cognitive defense mechanisms fail to neutralize the incoming data. The central nervous system invariably begins to leak the structural truth through involuntary physical movements. Her facial architecture did not dramatically collapse because she was entirely too practiced for that specific failure. Her vocal cords did not crack because individuals who reside in front of broadcast lenses learn the precise mechanics of maintaining surface tension even when the foundational floor beneath them begins to aggressively shift. But the physical space she occupied and the microkinetic movements of her extremities began to actively betray the narrative that her mouth steadfastly refused to concede. The initial biological betrayal materialized in the right hand. For 8 consecutive years in the public arena, that specific appendage had functioned as a primary instrument of her political vocabulary. It was a highly calibrated weapon of spatial dominance, routinely utilized to open, slice, point, and physically shape abstract ideological outrage into a consumable visual rhythm for the cameras. As the performance review progressed, the right hand automatically initiated a kinetic sequence rising approximately 4 inches from the surface of the mahogany table. It was the genesis of a familiar, aggressive gesture. But in this specific environment, the gesture had absolutely nowhere safe to deploy. The biological reflex had bypassed the strategic containment protocol, beginning to speak before the communications team could approve the sentence. She caught the movement midair and physically pressed the hand back down onto the flat surface. That microscopic correction telegraphed more verified data to the room than any written denial could have achieved. She had been conditioned by the Vance and Kennedy audits to understand that a loose gesture instantly mutates into a viral clip. The body is fundamentally honest in ways a press team cannot fully manage. For 1 fraction of a second, the hand attempted to reclaim its operational space, to perform, and to convert the sterile assessment back into a loud confrontation. She forced it flat like an individual desperately holding down a heavy lid on a containment vessel that is actively attempting to rupture. At that precise kinetic moment, the famous communicator fundamentally ceased to communicate. She was officially being evaluated. The second biological betrayal was architectural. The physical footprint she occupied at the witness table began to undergo a visible structural transformation. In the strict mechanics of political theater, space directly translates to authority. Her historical performance model was completely dependent on continuous expansion. She expanded with her hands, expanded with her visual focus, expanded with the acoustic force of a sentence fired across a room, and expanded through the camera lens until a standard committee hearing was forcibly upgraded into a national stage. But Johnson's binder had fundamentally reversed the physics of the room. As each color-coded tab was opened and assessed, the dimensions of the room mathematically shrank. Her elbows unconsciously drew inward, pinning against her torso. Her shoulders rolled forward just enough to register on the high-definition feed. The wide-angle lens documented a woman who had spent nearly a decade evolving into the largest physical presence in every room, suddenly attempting to drastically reduce the amount of oxygen she consumed. She was not experiencing a theatrical collapse. Collapse is a dramatic, visible event. She was experiencing contraction, and contraction is entirely involuntary. Every failing grade stripped away another inch of her spatial dominance. Every documented subject converted the grand political stage back into a small, claustrophobic school desk. By the conclusion of the 4th tab, the performer no longer looked like the author of the moment. She looked exactly like a student bracing for the final impact of a catastrophic report card. Assessment, when applied with sufficient patience, does not overpower a performance. It simply outlasts it. The final biological betrayal was the most conceptually lethal. It occurred precisely during the audit of the unanswered district phones. Her left hand initiated a slow lateral drift toward her personal smartphone. The device sat adjacent to her binder, functioning not merely as a piece of hardware, but as a vital, glowing organ. It was the physical extension of her political nervous system, directly hardwired to millions of followers, providing instant feedback, validation, digital applause, and a permanent rescue hatch from any physical room that ceased to cooperate with her brand. Under extreme psychological stress, her fingers drifted toward the device in the unconscious, automated manner that individuals reach for a phantom limb or a security mechanism. But the hand abruptly halted its trajectory exactly 1 inch away from the glass screen. Somewhere beneath the threshold of conscious thought, the biological system recognized the fatal trap. Johnson was actively describing the vast operational distance between digital followers and actual constituents. Her hand had instinctively reached for the exact object that symbolized the wrong audience. She rapidly redirected the hand back to the safety of her lap, but the high-definition lens had already secured the footage of that single inch. In the unforgiving environment of room H313, an inch is mathematically sufficient to terminate a narrative. An inch becomes the entire story when the hearing is strictly evaluating priority. The famous politician actively being graded on her failure to answer the telephone for constituents seeking emergency federal assistance had reflexively reached for the device that connected her to the digital crowd that manufactured her fame rather than the citizens who required her labor. This was not a legal argument. It was not a policy brief. It was a piece of physical body language so clean, so structurally perfect that it appeared professionally scripted, but it was infinitely more damaging precisely because it was not. It was a pure, unedited biological reflex, proving that the machinery of the brand was completely incompatible with the machinery of the job. The structural audit had meticulously processed the geographic, local, legislative, and financial documentation. The physical space within room H313 was heavily compressed by the weight of the accumulated data. At this precise juncture, Speaker Johnson executed a deliberate recalibration of his acoustic output. His vocal frequency did not increase in volume, nor did it harden into a harsher register. It shifted into a warmer, more measured tone. Within the strictly calculated physics of a congressional hearing, this specific infusion of warmth was structurally dangerous. When an interrogator utilizes overt hostility, it automatically activates the subject's defensive protocols, allowing the politician to seamlessly transition into the role of a persecuted victim. Hostility provides an escape hatch. However, Johnson's tone simulated the exact acoustic signature of an educator addressing a highly capable student who had been praised too early, insulated from rigorous testing, and falsely convinced that raw potential is mathematically equivalent to verified accomplishment. Disappointment, unlike hostility, provides no kinetic energy for a counterattack. It forces the subject to confront the physical void of their own labor. Johnson stated for the permanent record that he believed the representative was fundamentally talented, categorizing her as one of the most naturally gifted communicators in the history of the institution. This assertion of sincerity functioned as the sharpest edge of the indictment. The core allegation was not a lack of biological or cognitive capability. The core allegation was a fatal structural miscalculation. She had systematically mistaken the mechanics of communication for the mechanics of governance. He drew a hard, impenetrable boundary between the two architectures. The ability to generate a digital connection does not manufacture physical legislation. Viral media clips do not possess the statutory authority of federal laws. And most critically, digital followers who maintain the absolute freedom to unsubscribe, mute, or scroll past a broadcast are fundamentally distinct from biological constituents who remain tethered to the physical jurisdiction of an office when their Social Security disbursements fail to arrive. Before delivering the terminal evaluation, Johnson opened one final category within the binder: conviction. This tab transitioned the audit from professional competence to institutional character. He introduced the timeline. In 2019, the representative had publicly classified the act of voting present on a federal impeachment measure as an act of cowardice, explicitly stating that members are deployed to Washington to execute decisions, not to seek refuge within procedural fog. Johnson then juxtaposed this established baseline against the Iron Dome funding vote in 2021, a defensive grid engineered to intercept incoming ballistics. On that specific roll call, the representative registered a present vote. The physical documentation of that event included biological tears shed on the House floor, a 4-page written apology, an official reversal in 2024, and a subsequent reversal in 2026. When mapped on a graph, the data points did not illustrate a rigid structure of moral courage. They visually simulated a mechanical weather vane rotating wildly under the torque of whichever political pressure system was actively moving across the grid. Johnson's algorithmic conclusion was absolute. Conviction is not a metric that can be graded on a curve. An entity either maintains a fixed coordinate of belief, or the data permanently suggests that they do not. The diagnostic report was complete. Every isolated Wertstein book, the unread Munich briefing book, the locked district doors, the zero legislative outputs, the mislabeled financial disbursements, and the collapsing convictions had been systematically connected. They formed a single massive allegation. The structural gap between the brand's national marketing and the actual execution of the job had expanded to a physical dimension that the broadcast cameras could no longer digitally conceal. Johnson looked at the witness and asked the terminal question. It is the specific query utilized when an auditor requires the subject to verbally process the math without providing the answer. Representative, what grade would you give yourself? He did not sneer. He did not project volume. And crucially, he did not rush into the acoustic space that immediately followed the question. The subsequent silence that descended upon room H313 was an anomaly of physics. In the highly optimized environment of television broadcasting, a delay of 3 seconds triggers an emergency response. A delay of 5 seconds mimics the sensation of a transmission failure. The primary clock engaged. 7 seconds, 8 seconds, 9 seconds, 10 seconds, 11 seconds. Each individual second added a measurable layer of physical weight to the room. The silence ceased to function as a pause and mutated into an active, crushing environment. Standard politicians fear silence because it disrupts the performative rhythm. Johnson utilized the silence as an extraction mechanism, forcing the subject to internally calculate that every available verbal response would instantly incinerate upon contact with a documented ledger. During this 11-second temporal void, the cameras tracked a highly specific ocular movement. In previous institutional audits, the representative's optical sensors had operated on fixed protocols. Against Senator Kennedy, her eyes sought the camera lens, searching for the external audience to transform the room into a sympathetic clip. Against Senator Vance, her optical focus locked downward toward the table, waiting for the storm of receipts to pass overhead. But in the 11th second of Johnson's audit, her visual focus executed a completely unprecedented trajectory. Her eyes detached from the table, bypassed the broadcast lenses, and traveled directly to the back of room H313. They locked onto the green, illuminated exit sign suspended above the rear door. The duration of this optical lock was less than 2 seconds, but within the rigid mechanics of performance analysis, those 2 seconds represented a complete structural rupture of the established mythology. For 8 years, committee hearing rooms had functioned as the exact coordinates where she existed most completely, the localized environments where she manufactured villains, captured attention, and converted procedural procedure into personal theater. For the first time in her recorded professional history, her biological sensors identified a vector that did not point toward the stage, the applause, or the cameras. The sensors identified an extraction route. The physical space was no longer processing as a stage. The central nervous system was actively processing it as a hazard zone. Johnson did not need to break the silence with an aggressive follow-up. The binder had completed the calculation. He executed the physical action of closing the thick, color-coded manual. The sound of the cover hitting the desk finalized the semester, transmitting the absolute certainty that the final grade did not require verbalization because every entity operating within the perimeter already possessed the answer. The 11-second temporal void within room H 313 officially concluded when the representative finally re-engaged her vocal apparatus. The resulting acoustic output was clocked at strictly under 2 minutes in total duration. It was the shortest response sequence of the entire audit. When a political organism is physically cornered by highly specific granular data sets that cannot be cleanly neutralized by factual contradiction, the central nervous system automatically executes a structural reframe. She deployed the precise defensive shielding of identity and institutional authority. She rhetorically recategorized the entire 40-minute assessment as a sexist, condescending dynamic, explicitly framing it as a male authority figure grading a female, and specifically, the weaponization of institutional power against a woman of color. From a purely mechanical standpoint, this response was not a random calculation. It represented the absolute final exit ramp available within the containment zone. Johnson had provided zero raw material for alternative escapes. He had generated no elevated volume for her to condemn. He had delivered no overt personal insults for her communications team to crop into a fundraising email. He had committed no obvious overreach to drag into the center of the media narrative. Therefore, she reached for the singular remaining tool capable of converting a cold performance review back into a high-temperature culture war. For a brief duration, the acoustic output simulated the sound of an obsolete political machine, desperately attempting to restart its primary engine. However, forensic audits do not strictly evaluate the acoustic noise. They systematically evaluate the negative space. The true structural weight of her 2-minute response was located entirely in what the subject actively chose to omit. The audio file contained zero references to the geographical location of Venezuela. It contained zero references to the defensive parameters of Taiwan. It offered zero explanations for the Munich transcript. It provided zero mathematical defense for the restricted district office hours, the unmonitored communication lines, or the locked doors in Queens. It ignored the 60-minute town hall, the 6 constituent questions, and the idling SUV. It presented zero justification for the 0 enacted bills, zero explanation for the Federal Election Commission filings, and most critically, it contained zero numerical output for the requested grade. After a comprehensive review built upon 5 specific documented subjects, a response that aggressively attacks the framework while systematically ignoring the physical data ceases to function as resistance. It sounds exactly like the specific behavior currently being evaluated. Deflection from an individual who has just been methodically informed that deflection is their primary operational failure does not project strength. It mathematically functions as confirmation. Speaker Johnson registered zero kinetic reaction to the 2-minute reframe. His absolute restraint neutralized the attempt far more effectively than any verbal counterattack. He simply initiated his physical extraction sequence. He manually closed the massive color-coded binder. The acoustic snap of the rings locking together signaled the absolute termination of the review. It had looked from the very beginning like a teacher's formal grade book, and the physical reality proved that it was exactly that. He placed his pen precisely into the spine of the object. He stood from his position and methodically buttoned his suit jacket, executing the motion completely, exhibiting the rigid, almost irritating neatness of a biological entity who fundamentally believes microscopic physical habits directly mirror macroscopic capabilities. He exited the operational perimeter of room H313. He did not execute a single backward optical scan toward the witness table. There was absolutely nothing left to perform and zero remaining metrics to prove. The grades were permanently logged into the federal record. The student who had initiated the timeline with a verbal assault possessed zero remaining material to submit. The physical hearing was terminated, but the documented data immediately fractured into 4 distinct, highly optimized digital projectiles that saturated the national grid. The first digital extraction was the Venezuela geographic coordinate. Venezuela is above the equator, possessed a brutal algorithmic simplicity. The internet processes spatial errors with maximum efficiency. This specific artifact required 0 legal degrees, 0 party loyalty, and 0 foreign policy seminars to comprehend. By reproducing the exact Munich transcript, complete with every verbal hesitation, and following it with a cold geographic correction, the exchange functioned as a global map quiz, resulting in a catastrophic failure. It demonstrated an entity auditioning for executive power who was physically unable to process the basic homework sitting on page 13 of a briefing manual. The second digital artifact possessed a different, far more lethal trajectory. It contained the district office operational metrics. This specific data packet documenting the appointment-only service, the unanswered phones, and the shortened town hall did not circulate exclusively through partisan networks. It aggressively penetrated local political networks, constituent service groups, and community boards. It resonated with ordinary biological subjects who understand the precise friction of an administrative office treating access as a restricted favor. This clip could not be ideologically dismissed because it documented the absolute minimum standard of employment. Failing a minimum standard is the most structural embarrassment possible because no entity can logically claim the standard was set impossibly high. The third artifact encapsulated the terminal grade and the subsequent 11-second temporal void. This sequence successfully crossed all ideological boundaries because it triggered a universally recognized human response. Every biological subject who has ever sat across from an authoritative figure and been forced to account for their physical output recognizes the exact physiological sensation of a catastrophic truth forming within the chest cavity long before the vocal cords can attempt to survive its pronunciation. The silence was not empty. It was pressurized with every single word she could not safely broadcast. But the fourth and final artifact operated on pure visual physics. It required 0 audio transcript, 0 voiceover, and 0 external commentary. It was the raw optical feed of the subject's visual sensors moving upward to lock onto the green illuminated exit sign. That 2-second optical displacement became the absolute shorthand for the entire 60-minute audit. It captured the exact chronological coordinate where an organism that had built a massive career by dominating space and feeding off cameras suddenly recognized that the environment had become toxic. It was the precise moment the architecture of performance collided with the architecture of assessment, and assessment achieved total dominance. The physical termination of the hearing within room H313 did not represent the conclusion of the audit. It merely initiated the systemic aftermath. The political consequences of the 60-minute assessment landed precisely on the specific, unyielding coordinate that the subject's defensive apparatus could not intercept: basic competence. Her designated media defenders were mathematically unable to sweep the structural damage away using the standard vocabulary of unfair partisan attacks. This failure occurred because Speaker Johnson had completely refused to frame the assessment around subjective ideology, personal tone, or theoretical philosophy. He had successfully connected the international void in Munich directly to the localized failures in district service, the absolute absence of legislative output, the chaotic financial management, and the collapsing personal convictions. These data points were no longer functioning as separate, isolated embarrassments temporarily floating through a transient news cycle. They had been algorithmically fused together as documented symptoms of one massive underlying condition. the physical gap between a highly polished national brand and localized administrative competence. Johnson established the permanent distance between a digital figure who possesses the capacity to dominate public attention and a federal representative who is still structurally required to execute the unglamorous labor of answering physical telephones, reading thick briefing books, building functional legislative coalitions, and filing federal paperwork correctly. Once that specific analytical frame was constructed, every future political calculation regarding her potential presidential trajectory carried the exact same structural shadow. The central evaluation was no longer whether the electorate found her personally likable. It was whether the electorate believed she possessed the mechanical capacity to execute the job. The Munich footage, which possessed the potential to remain a transient one-cycle stumble in February, was permanently reframed. Every operational debate preparation manual for the 2028 executive cycle now contained the Taiwan transcript and the Venezuela geographic error, primed for immediate deployment. These artifacts were not categorized as exotic opposition research. They functioned as the baseline intelligence tests that naturally materialize the exact moment foreign policy is introduced. The fundamental question confronting the brand was no longer whether she possessed raw charisma, because no serious entity doubted that specific metric. The fatal question was whether the political movement had utilized charisma as a direct substitute for verified knowledge. It asked whether the apparatus had insulated its primary star from objective assessment for so long that the assessment itself was perceived as a hostile attack. For any political asset attempting to cross the vast operational distance between a celebrity legislator and a commander-in-chief, that question is mathematically lethal. The most devastating verification of Johnson's audit did not manifest in the press room. It manifested in the quiet, desperate recalibration of the representative's own local infrastructure. Within a single week of the hearing, her congressional apparatus executed a series of unannounced district office reforms. The operational hours for the Bronx facility were rapidly extended from 1 weekday to 3. The Queens facility extended its physical availability to include Fridays. A secondary communication line was hurriedly installed within the Jackson Heights office. Crucially, these structural reforms were not publicly broadcast. They were not accompanied by digital fireworks, packaged into a victorious campaign email, or deployed as a branded constituent service initiative featuring highly curated photography and accessibility slogans. They were quietly discovered by the exact same investigative reporter whose data Johnson had utilized during the assessment. That silent discovery functioned as its own absolute unspinnable admission. In the strict mechanics of organizational management, an entity does not fix physical systems that are not broken, and an entity absolutely does not quietly recalibrate its baseline infrastructure immediately following a televised oversight hearing unless that specific hearing struck a verified structural failure. The systemic damage immediately began to register within the polling analytics. Progressive media networks fractured exactly along the established competence line. While some voices attempted to defend the Munich disaster by arguing that foreign policy gaps exist across all political parties, other highly sympathetic analysts admitted what the color-coded binder had made mathematically impossible to ignore. A national movement cannot afford executive leaders whose knowledge base abruptly terminates at domestic talking points. The analytical algorithms began explicitly separating her favorability metrics from her readiness metrics. That distinction is structurally devastating because while brand favorability can survive an embarrassing viral clip, executive readiness cannot survive a permanent pattern of unread briefing books. Her internal qualified to be president index dropped sharply among primary voters. The data indicated that voters were not necessarily rejecting the biological person. They were actively questioning the job fit. That is the exact distance between a brand the public enjoys, consuming on a screen, and a candidate the public trusts with control over the federal government. Speaker Johnson provided absolutely zero victory laps. That specific mechanical restraint ensured the audit would continue to sting indefinitely. When questioned by the press regarding the productivity of the hearing, he did not respond like a politician chasing the next viral engagement. He responded exactly like an educator. He stated into the record that teachers do not derive pleasure from issuing failing grades. They issue them because the student fundamentally requires the data to understand their exact coordinates within the system. He concluded with a final microscopic cut that penetrated the armor without generating a sound. He simply hoped she would read the briefing book next time. At the absolute ground level of the Republic, the audit landed not as a political spectacle, but as verified recognition. In Jackson Heights, Rosa Gutierrez, a local business owner, watched the Munich and district office segments. She possessed the memory of her neighbor waiting 3 hours at the localized town hall, only to watch the representative process 6 questions and immediately extract herself via the SUV. Rosa systematically canceled her monthly financial donation. What remained in that transaction was not active anger. It was an empty, negative space where political belief used to reside. In Ohio, Crystal Atkins watched the sequence from a recovery center and perceived 6 distinct variations of the exact same structural failure. She recognized the massive, unyielding distance between public identity and private performance. The entire 60-minute diagnostic report was finalized. A heavily engineered political brand had physically collided with a strict, color-coded gradebook. And the gradebook fundamentally did not care about the volume of digital followers, the rhythm of the applause, or the sharpness of the opening insult. A representative who governed entirely through performance had intersected with a former teacher who assessed entirely through precision. And precision mathematically achieved total dominance, because the facts utilized to dismantle the mythology were not floating in the abstract ether. They were categorized, tabbed, documented, and delivered sequentially. 6 questions, 1 hour, 1 idling SUV, 0 enacted bills. 1 cartographic error, 1 missing geopolitical answer, 1 fabricated compliance filing, 11 seconds of absolute silence, and 1 illuminated exit sign. She performs, he grades, and as the unyielding physics of every classroom dictates, an entity may attempt to argue with the teacher, but an entity can never argue with the transcript.